Homo sapiens have existed for over 300,000 years. Countless other species of humans have existed before and after us. Some of these strange creatures were more ape than man. Others lived around the world millions of years before we did. They were our ancestors, and they still live within us today. 7 million years ago, during the late Miocene, many strange animals roamed our planet. In Africa, deadly saber-toothed cats and large bears stalked the African plains. At this time, our ancestors were still bound to life in the trees. These animals would have looked very close to modern-day chimpanzees. In the trees, they are very dominant animals. Not even a leopard dares to go after a chimp in their element. The trees were their safe haven, but on the ground, they are basically defenseless. Life was relatively good for our ancestors until a geological shift would change everything. At the same time, the Himalayas were forming. One of the African plates rifted. Mountains formed, which prevented moisture crossing from the Indian Ocean into East Africa. This caused much of East Africa to dry out. What was once lush forest now became a much more dry and mountainous region. Our ancestors were no longer able to stay in the trees all day. They had to venture out onto the landscape in order to find food and water. On the ground, these early hominins were poorly adapted to the landscape. Large groups would have been essential to surviving in this dangerous environment. There have been 4 species of early hominins discovered in Africa. Though these animals were still very chimp-like, they started to show more human traits, like smaller jaws and canines. These animals lived hard lives, and predators often ate the first men. 4 million years ago, human evolution started to pick up. This is when the first Australopithecines began to appear. These animals existed during a very important time in human history, for they were the first human ancestors to be bipedal. Walking on 2 legs provides many benefits. On 2 legs, it is much easier to see over tall grass and long distances. This would have helped these animals look out for predators. In addition to this, standing upright is much more intimidating to predators. Modern-day humans sometimes will scare off grizzly bears just by making themselves look bigger. Walking on 2 legs only uses 1/4 of the energy as walking on all 4s. And finally, it frees up the 4 limbs while moving. This allowed early humans to carry things like food, their young, and even weapons. Australopithecines walked upright and had more human-like features, but they still had a brain only slightly larger than that of a chimpanzee. Sexual dimorphism is a condition in which members of the same species differ based on sex. For example, human males on average are about 15% larger than females. In some cases, male Australopithecines were 50% larger than the females. Males stood about 4.5 feet tall, while females were only close to 4 feet. Large males could weigh up to 100 pounds, while females only weighed about 70. Lucy is the name of a very famous specimen of the species Australopithecus afarensis. Lucy was 3'7" and weighed 64 pounds. She had a small brain, like that of a chimpanzee, but the pelvis and the leg bones were almost identical and functioned like that of modern humans. This showed with certainty that Lucy's species stood upright and walked erect. Lucy looked somewhat human, but at the same time, so primitive. She was a full-grown adult at only 12 years old when she died. No one knows how she died, but there's evidence that a carnivore may have scavenged her after death. Her fossil dates back to 3.2 million years ago. At this time, it was long thought that this species was not using tools, until recent evidence. Evidence of tool marks on fossilized. Bones have been attributed to Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis. They most likely did not hunt this animal, but the use of sharp stone tools is a monumental leap in human development. It is one thing to use a random rock for a task. Many animals do this, but to use a manufactured tool, like a sharp stone, flake, would have been revolutionary for the time. These tools allowed these primitive people to scavenge calorie-dense meat and get at the nutritious marrow. A proposed theory about Australopithecines was that they would throw rocks for defense. It makes a lot of sense. If there were 50 of these men throwing rocks at a predator, then it might think twice before attacking. The only problem with this theory is it's really hard to prove. As we know, though, later species of human used throwing, spears and other throwing devices, so it is plausible that these primitive people would use rocks for defense. Australopithecines were our distant ancestors, and there is no doubt that they struggled for survival. But they survived and led to new species. Australopithecus afarensis branched off into two species, Australopithecus africanus and Paranthropus. Australopithecus africanus is the ancestor to all of our relatives. Paranthropus branched off from the tree and became a new species, separate from our own. Australopithecines lasted until about 2.1 million years ago, when Africanus evolved into a new lineage of apes. This lineage is called Homo. Homo habilis is the earliest known species in this genus. In Latin, this means handyman. This was because of the innovation that the species pioneered with tools. Though it was not the first hominin to use stone, flake tools, there's evidence of more widespread use and more sophisticated tools. This species was able to create these tools because of a huge increase in brain size. The Australopithecines and Paranthropus before them had brain sizes of about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. Homo habilis on average had a brain size of 640 cubic centimeters. This increase in brain volume allowed the species to be better at tool-making, decisions, and social bonds. But it didn't come without a cost. Modern-day human brains use 20% of our daily energy. Brains are costly organs, but if they're used right, they're worth it. Since this animal developed a bigger brain, it must have been more successful in its environment than previous hominins. It was most likely still not a hunter yet, but rather an opportunistic omnivore. Standing a mere 4 feet in height, it was still a very small and primitive hominid. Though it is in the genus Homo, it has been proposed to consider it as an Australopithecine instead. This species lived around other species of hominin, but it had proved to be more successful. Another species named Homo rudolfensis existed during this time as well. The species is slightly different from habilis, but many consider them to be the same species. Either way, they would give way to the next great species of Homo. Homo erectus was the next great leap for humanity. It was the first species to use fire, hunt large game, and also spread around the world. The average male individual was 5'10" and 150 pounds. The frame of this animal and the changes in the anatomy of the shoulders allowed them to be much better at throwing. Males were about 25% larger than females, which was close to Homo sapiens. This species varied since it was very widely dispersed over such a long period of time. There are many subspecies. On average, Homo erectus's brain was 1,000 cubic centimeters. Some of the earlier members had smaller brain sizes, but the later surviving populations had brain sizes slightly smaller than modern-day humans. The huge leap in brain size between habilis and erectus allowed for many more possibilities than any previous hominid. Homo erectus first appeared about 2 million years ago, but fossils have been found in Asia and Africa, so their real origin is unknown. Like I said earlier, these animals were the first to use fire that we know about. Solid evidence that Homo erectus used and controlled fire dates back to 400,000 years ago, but there's plenty of evidence to show that they might have used it much earlier. 1.4 million-year-old collections of artifacts have been found in Kenya that were heated to a temperature of 400 degrees Celsius. There are countless other sites that are disputed, but the common consensus is that Homo erectus controlled fire at the earliest 1.5 million years ago, and likely by 1 million years ago. Fire allows for thousands of possibilities. One of these, of course, would be warmth. In relatively warm places, the temperature can plummet at night. Fire would let these people stay warm at night, as well as scare away any predators. Sitting around a fire may have been a very important step for hominid culture. By this point in hominid evolution, it is likely that language was already in use. Scholars assume that the first language developed in Homo habilis, so it is likely that Homo erectus was able to speak fairly well. I'm sure you've all experienced conversations around campfires, and this may have been a crucial aspect of our ancestors' evolution. Social bonds allow for better teamwork and cultural evolution. The second major use is cooking. Cooking does a number of things for food. It softens bonds between the cells of tough plants and meat, which in turn makes them more digestible. Less energy is used digesting cooked food than raw food. Cooking is like a way to start digestion before entering the mouth. It also sterilizes the food from any foodborne illnesses that may lie within. A fairly common theory is that by cooking food, Homo erectus was able to get enough nutrition to have a large brain. With more calories to spare, a large brain seems like a good investment. Another good investment was drying meat. Dried meat with fire was perhaps a very important step in human history. This way, early humans could store food for the future. Besides cooking, fire actually provides new and better ways to hunt. Homo erectus and many other species of hominin started grass fires in order to control pest populations. This way, they could stop pest animals from stealing their food, and they could also eat any of the animals killed by the fire. Another strategy that these people may have used was using fire to corral an animal in a certain area, where they then could hunt them in a set-up position. Fire was also used to fire-harden spears, though evidence of fire-hardened spears is not found until much later. It is probable that they used them. In China, they have found stone-tipped spears from a group known as Peking man. Peking man is a late-surviving Homo erectus subspecies. The fact that they also made stone-tipped spears shows us that their tool-making was very advanced. One of the most versatile and commonly found tools from this period was the hand axe. Hand axes were used for butchering meat, processing plants, and 1,000 other uses. These axes were the multi-tools of their day, and there are hundreds of discovered examples. Other tools have been found that may just look like bits of rock, but they're actually specialized tools. But what if Homo erectus also made seafaring vessels? Here's an article written about this possibility. It reads, "While no remaining boats used by Homo erectus have been found, potential evidence of this species' habitation on isolated islands suggests that it may have been able to travel many miles across an open sea." In 2008, Russian researchers found very primitive stone tools on Socotra, a completely isolated island more than 150 miles off the Horn of Africa and 240 miles off the coast of Yemen. The researchers estimate that their discoveries could be anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million years old, which is firmly within the time frame of Homo erectus. The possibility that these men were able to create a boat, or at least travel to remote islands in some way, is an indication of the species' intelligence. Another thing that these animals were known for was living in caves. The stigma around caves and cavemen is really unfortunate because these men were not dumb, and they do not deserve to be remembered that way. Caves provide excellent protection against the elements and are good places to hide from predators. Homo erectus was not some primitive ape, but rather paved the way for all future hominids. They were a crucial step in human evolution, and they pioneered so many things like controlled fire, complex tools, maybe boats, and possibly even a complex culture. Since Homo erectus was so widespread, this gave the opportunity for the species to evolve into new species. This is where the story of human history becomes very confusing. Anthropologists are still not certain of what relation these animals all share with each other. The next species step here was Homo antecessor. This species first appeared in Western Europe 1.4 million years ago. Antecessor has been proposed to be the intermediate species between Homo erectus and future European species. This is still a theory, and this may change with future findings. The next species to appear was Homo heidelbergensis. This species shows how these animals were getting closer and closer to modern humans. Heidelbergensis had a brain volume of 130 cubic centimeters, making it only very slightly smaller than the average modern-day human. Along with this, it had a smaller brow and smaller jaws. On average, the males were about 5'9" and 140 pounds. That is a normal height for a hominin, but at one point, they averaged over 7 feet. According to Lee Berger of the University of Iowa, Witwatersrand, tibia, and femoral remains indicate that the populations of Homo heidelbergensis between 350,000 and 400,000 years ago were routinely over 7 feet tall. According to him, this was a short-lived experiment that lasted during a grassland expansion, which led to very large ungulates and antelopes. It is incredible that these hominids grew so large to take advantage of their ecosystem. Imagine coming across a tribe of people where they're all over 7 feet in height. Heidelbergensis was also a very advanced toolmaker. A 400,000-year-old site in Germany showed us the use of fire-hardened spears to hunt prey. 8 spears were found alongside stone tools and horse remains. One of these spears was stabbed through the pelvis of the animal. At another site in Germany, a spear was found stuck in the ribs of a straight-tusked elephant. They were not just burnt sticks, but rather highly sophisticated tools. They are balanced 1/3 the way down the shaft, which suggests that they were for throwing, like a modern-day javelin. In their thrown qualities, the spears are equal to modern-day tournament javelins. During tests, the athletes were able to throw these recreations 230 feet. The fact that they were able to take down prehistoric horses and elephants shows us how dominant these animals were. As you can see, these ancient men were creating highly sophisticated and deadly hunting tools 400,000 years ago. The Heidelbergensis that lived in Europe evolved into Homo neanderthalensis, or as most people know them, Neanderthals. Neanderthals had short, stocky bodies, thick bones, a heavy brow, and large noses. The earliest fossils date back to 450,000 years ago. They are known from numerous fossils and stone tools. Neanderthals are usually portrayed as simple, brutish cavemen, but that is a misconception. Neanderthals may have still been primitive in terms of social skills, but their brains were actually bigger than those of modern humans. Modern human brains average about 2,300 cubic centimeters. Neanderthal brains were around 1,600 cubic centimeters. An extra 300 cubic centimeters of brain volume is not something to scoff at. For comparison, the relatively primitive-brained Homo erectus had a brain volume of about 1,000 cubic centimeters. Modern humans have just 300 more than them, and we're considered much smarter. So if Neanderthals had 300 more than us, does that mean they were geniuses? Well, no. While they had larger brains, they weren't necessarily smarter than us. Much of their extra brain volume was likely used for better vision and smell. Of course, we cannot be completely certain how these animals functioned, but the fact that they had better sensory abilities than us is still impressive. At this time, 400,000 years ago, there were a few hominid species living around the world. We know that Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis both lived in Europe. In other parts of the world, Homo erectus was still abundant. The next species to evolve was Homo sapiens. Yes, the great species that includes every human alive in the world today. It is still a bit of a mystery which species Homo sapiens evolved from. Many researchers think it evolved from populations of Homo erectus in Africa, while others believe it was from Homo heidelbergensis. Either way, a new species eventually evolved into the first Homo sapiens around 350,000 years ago. Our species had many differences compared to others. First of all, we had very different anatomical features. Human skeletons are relatively gracile and fragile compared to species like Neanderthals. This may seem like a simple or unimportant detail, but it's actually a key reason for our success. Because of our weaker build, we became much better at forming groups and cooperating. Not only did we have more fragile skeletons, but we also developed weaker muscles. There is evidence that the growth and complexity in human brains were due to the acceleration of metabolome evolution. Metabolome evolution is very complex, but here's a simplified explanation of what has been discovered. A study using GCM's, gas chromatography mass spectrometry, methodology looked at the differences between humans, chimps, and macaques in different regions of the brain. What they found were major differences in the prefrontal cortex and the lateral parts of the cerebral cortex. These areas are associated with complex cognitive functions such as reasoning, planning, social behavior, and general intelligence. We were smarter and had better teamwork than all of our relatives. This growth in brain function was paralleled with the drastic reduction in muscular strength, so the price we paid for a bigger brain was weaker strength. 300,000 years ago, when humans were still living in Africa, we lived alongside a few species of hominid. One of these species was Homo naledi. This species is a mystery. In Anther, it seems this small-brained ape had not evolved much since the day of the Australopithecines. Though it was bipedal and showed some characteristics of Homo, it was more like an Australopithecus. The hands of the animal were adapted to climbing, and its diet consisted of roots and tubers. It is likely that it was a late surviving primitive ape that never moved on the way the other hominids did. Here's the map of the distribution of discovered humans 300,000 years ago. In Europe lived Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis, and in Africa lived Homo sapiens and Homo naledi. All around Europe and the Middle East lived populations of Homo erectus and many other subspecies that derived from it. Over the next thousands of years, humans would evolve and thrive all over the world. Things could stay relatively the same around the world, except for that Homo heidelbergensis went extinct 200,000 years ago. The next great burst of human expansion would appear around 70,000 years ago. This is when we see many species emerge and others disappear. Homo sapiens ventured out of Africa at the earliest 150,000 years ago, but major migrations of humans out of Africa would start about 70,000 years ago. Here's a map of what human populations may have looked like before Homo sapiens left Africa 70,000 years ago. Keep in mind, there may be populations that we have not discovered, and also we don't know their true ranges. So let's go over this map. In Europe, there still lived Neanderthals. In northern Asia and parts of Russia, there lived Denisovans. Denisovans evolved from Homo heidelbergensis that went into Asia. Little is known about the species, but it is distinct from humans and Neanderthals. In southern Asia, there still lived populations of advanced Homo erectus. These populations were much smarter and more advanced than the archaic Homo erectus from millions of years ago. Homo floresiensis, also known as the hobbits, lived in Indonesia. These men, on average, were 3'7". The reason they were so small is because of insular dwarfism, also known as island dwarfism. They possibly evolved to become small because of limited resources on the island. Alongside a small body, they also had very small brains. Their estimated brain size is 382 cubic centimeters, making it the size of a chimp's brain. While I was making this video, a new species of Homo was actually discovered. Little is known about Homo luzonensis because we only have a few bones. As of now, the curvature of the toe bone suggests that this animal may have still climbed trees often. This species was very small as well. They might have been the same height as Homo floresiensis, but they also might have been smaller. These relatively australopithecine features of this animal suggest it to be primitive in nature, and it most likely evolved from populations of Homo erectus in the area. The discovery of that species shows us that there are still many species that have not been discovered. Then, 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa. But this time, we were the first species to invent the bow. Bows allowed us to be much more efficient hunters than any other hominid species. We could shoot arrows further, and also shoot multiple shots in succession. This would help us take down large game and dominate in war. Though the other hominid species were stronger and more built than us, they couldn't compete with our weapons and our strategy. Humans were probably not getting in wars and battles with other tribes often, but when we did, we had the upper hand. We also bred with Neanderthals and Denisovans as we spread across the world. As soon as we left Africa, we met the Neanderthals. This interbreeding would allow us the opportunity to inherit genes that were better adapted to the cold. The genes we inherited affected our skin color, brain function, and sleep patterns. Modern-day sub-Saharan Africans never left, and therefore they never interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Because of this, most sub-Saharan Africans are true purebred Homo sapiens, while most other people have some other hominid DNA mixed in with them. As humans spread across the world, many of the other species would go extinct. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the only species of Homo left. We were too successful and smart for the other species, and most likely drove them to extinction. Though these other species are extinct, some of them still live within us today. As you can see by this map, populations of humans that left Africa have about 2% Neanderthal DNA. It varies, and you may have more or less depending on the region. Populations in Oceania have the most DNA from extinct hominids. Some people have 2% Neanderthal DNA and 5% Denisovan DNA. That is crazy, that 7% of their DNA is from extinct hominids. Sherpas are one of the major ethnic groups native to the mountainous regions of Nepal. It has been known for years that these people are very adapted to their mountainous environment. Here's an article about the genes that these people received from Denisovans. It reads, "A superathlete gene that helps Sherpas and other Tibetans. Breathe easy at high altitudes was inherited from an ancient species of human." That's the conclusion of a new study, which finds that the gene variant came from people known as Denisovans, who went extinct soon after they mated with ancestors of Europeans and Asians about 40,000 years ago. This is the first time a version of a gene acquired from interbreeding with another type of human has been shown to help modern humans adapt to their environment. Researchers discovered in 2010 that Tibetans had several genes that helped them use smaller amounts of oxygen more efficiently, allowing them to deliver enough of it to their limbs while exercising at high altitude. It is crazy that these humans are more adapted to their environment because they bred with Denisovans 40,000 years ago. I can't imagine how many other genes humans have acquired from other extinct species of hominin that we do not know about, that may help us in our environments. The human story is one of failure and success. Many species before us spread around the world, but ultimately it would be Homo sapiens that would reign supreme. We conquered the world and interbred with the inhabitants. It is unfortunate that there are no other species of Homo left, but a few species still live within us today. Thanks for watching this video. In the coming years, information displayed may be obsolete. I put a lot of effort into producing this video, but I am sure I made some mistakes. If you have noticed any scientific inaccuracies or just mistakes in this video, leave a comment down below correcting me. I truly think that it is unfortunate that there are no other species of hominin left. I can only imagine the way that they would have affected human history. You'd hear about ancient tribes and Neanderthals dominating other human species, but now they all had to go extinct. Just wonder how. It affected our modern history as well in the early 1900s. There probably segregation against Neanderthals or put them to work as slaves or something, and maybe they dominate professional sports now, like I can imagine in like MMA. How do you think? In the end, Earth all would do. It'd be so much stronger than everyone else. I don't know. It's just a thought of mine. So I hope you guys enjoyed learning about our human story, and I plan on making more anthropology videos in the future. This video was a summary of human history, but there is thousands of more things to learn about our human past that I hope to make videos up in the future. I did not cover anything past 20,000 years ago, because by that time, all other hominid species were extinct and humans were pretty much the same as they are today. So thanks for watching this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.